As I mentioned, I'm Jessica Miller. I'm the acquisitions editor here at SAGE for our criminology and criminal justice list. And typically the junior faculty professional development teaching workshop is something that we sponsor and host at ACJS. This would have been our 12th year hosting the workshop. We have our amazing workshop coordinator on the line with us, Brian Payne. And typically what we would do is the day before the conference and then the first day of the conference as well, as we would have around 7 to 8 sessions of just opportunities for junior faculty to participate in some professional development workshops. But with ACJS being canceled, we have moved this virtually, and we just make the decision to open it up. Since we can now host more people, then we'll just fit in one room. So we're absolutely thrilled to have you all here today, and looking forward to other workshop topics that will come up as well. As we wait for Stacy to come back on the line, hopefully she'll be able to get back up. But don't worry, if we need to, I can always share the slides from my screen as well. So thank you so much for your patience as we look to get this up and running. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. You can also introduce yourself as well. You know, we would like for this to have as much discussion with this as we can, but also just to help you get familiar with some of the different ways that you can use Zoom yourself as well with your students.
Okay, so Brian, did you want to kind of say anything about the workshops and things?
Yes, I did. Thank you. It's interesting. If you're doing the math like I am, if this didn't happen, we would all be in San Antonio right now, getting ready to go to happy hour or something. Well, maybe not this early in the day, but this did happen, and so we're scrambling to find our sense of normalcy. When I talked with Jessica about the workshop, she asked what I thought about the idea of doing the webinar type series instead, and I thought it was a fantastic idea. And she mentioned that Stacy had offered to do one on shifting to online, which what could be more relevant and more timely. I do admit that when Jessica asked me when we should do it, I said, I might have pushed it out a few weeks, and Stacy's response was, you guys are nuts. These people want this now. Let's do it now. So Stacy was good enough and kind enough to get this together now so that we can go forward with and start our webinar series with the most timely topic. I do note that this is all new to me. I have taught asynchronous classes in the past, but I don't consider myself a pro there, nor a pro in the regular classroom for that matter. I do note, I was telling some folks that my daughter had to go to Zoom and for her classes, and when she went to Zoom, my wife went out and bought new curtains for her bedroom, because gosh forbid that her new curtains her old curtains were seen in the background. Now, I thought that was funny until just a few minutes ago when I pinned Jessica so I could see what books were on her bookshelf. And I didn't see either Stacy's book or my book on her bookshelf. So maybe in the future when she does these, we might happen to see our books pinged there. But anyway, I'm just by way of that to say that SAGE is doing an awful lot to try and support you, and this is one of those things. The subsequent parts of the series that we'll see will include an active learning discussion, the last lecture by Alex Picaro. We'll talk about courseware, we'll talk about how to play games, we'll talk about how to do your research, talk about race and inequality, and also the Ken Peake Award winner will talk about how to bring together research and teaching. So I'm very pleased with the fact that each of our presenters who is going to be in San Antonio agreed that they would present. So you're getting the best of all possible deliveries here. Now, Stacy, it's even better. This is the icing on the cake, because you had we not had this situation, we wouldn't have had this great opportunity to hear from Stacy about how to move online. Stacy is a professor of Criminal Justice at Cal State University, Fullerton. She's written a number of books for SAGE, including Women in Crime, and as well Women in Crime, The Essentials. And she has a criminal justice policy book, and she has a criminal justice and crime book with SAGE. She got her PhD from UC Boulder, and she's been teaching in areas related to her research interests include feminist criminology, juvenile delinquency, death penalty, and criminal justice policy. We are especially benefiting from the fact that Stacy is a pro in online teaching. So Stacy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Brian, for that introduction. I hope I live up to that intro. My goodness. Well, I want to thank everybody for taking time today to just kind of be here on this webinar. I know that maybe you're here because you've done some online before, or maybe all of a sudden it's like, okay, I guess I'm teaching online right now. And I know that there's a lot of Facebook groups and a lot of articles that are coming out of the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed, almost to the point that it feels like you're on information overload. There's so much, going on, and so many conversations about what online ed looks like normally, what it looks like on the fly, what are some of the things you should think about kind of given the time that we're in. And so that's really what I want to focus on today, is trying to bring together some of the conversations that have been going on within higher ed over the last couple of weeks, as we've all transitioned to this, new awkward sort of normal, if you will. And so for today, I'm breaking this up. I don't want to, spend, too much in terms of really, going into, what are the best practices for online ed, because that's not the situation that we're in. We're trying to figure out how to deal with this, how to care for our students, and really how to care for each other in this journey. But I want to make sure that I leave a lot of time here for question and answer here at the end. So if you can hold kind of your questions to the end, that would be really helpful to me. But I really want to focus on what are some of the key strategies that we need to think about right now in terms of online ed. Talk a little bit about the pros and cons of synchronous versus asynchronous learning. Certainly what we would normally do in terms of these two areas might be a little bit different. And so I really want to focus on some of the best practices for today, but also highlight some of those challenges for online learning today. And then finally, I think it's really important that we talk about work-life balance. I know that that's kind of this joke or comedy, even in normal times in academia, but I think it's particularly important today. Maybe you have spouses that are now also working from home, kids that are going to school working. I was joking that my electric company is taunting me by saying, well, you've used this much electricity this month. And I'm like, yep, yes, I have. My internet traffic pretty much looks like, the 405 on a Thanksgiving day. It's not pretty, but so thinking about some of those issues and how we can still get work done and be there for our students. So starting off though, I want to kind of couch this in just kind of some key points. And this comes from a faculty member that I saw at UNC Chapel Hill. And I thought that what he put together was really insightful in thinking about what are some of the things for online ed on the fly. And I think the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that nobody signed up for this. That most of us teach face-to-face because we want to teach in that environment. You want to be in a classroom. So regardless of your experience with online ed in the past, you have maybe a class or several classes that you chose to be face-to-face, and now because of circumstances, they are online. But I think even broader than the teaching aspect here is that kind of very sudden end to the collective energy that's on a university campus that you have with your colleagues, or maybe even just outside of work, kind of with your friends and your activities and things like that. So I think it's really important to acknowledge right up front that, this is, not something that we chose. Second is to be humane and kind. Everyone is going through these changes. Your students are scared. Maybe your colleagues are scared. And I think that the more human that we are through all of this, the better that we will be at the end of it. To try and support your students as human and prioritize some of the things that make sense for you and your classroom. You want to maybe ask yourself, how will you support maybe that student who's struggling the most through all of this, which maybe that is your typical MO as a faculty member. Maybe that's different, but I think it's important to acknowledge. It's also important to acknowledge that this is not going to be a semester with, examples of best practices in online ed. We will do what we can. And I think a lot of universities are, thinking about that as well. I know that there's been conversations at my institution about how will student opinion questionnaires be used, and things like that. How will grades be assessed? There's a lot of conversations around that. I think that there's a number of ways that you can build a quality online experience under normal circumstances. But when you're rushing into online training with online teaching with very little time, very little training and resources, that's not it. That's not it. That's not best practices. As a faculty member, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we can't always do exactly the same things that we had planned to do online that we were going to do in the classroom. That's not to say that you can't find really amazing and engaging exercises for, and assignments for your class in an online environment, but they will be possibly different, right? If you say you were teaching a policing class and you wanted students to do a ride-along, not really feasible in this time, right? It's not reasonable. And as faculty, we need to be able to say that that's okay. So what can we do as faculty members? I think we can still find ways to foster intellectual curiosity, whether that be, when you're normally in the classroom ripping your lecture notes from the headlines. I think that there still is a lot that can be done there, that you can still get students engaged thinking about your course material, to create that sort of human connection, just as you might have done in the classroom. Find ways that you can do that in this sort of virtual experience. Want to find maybe ways to be available to your students. Is that online office hours? I've actually renamed my office hours to be calling virtual connection hours, because that really acknowledges that I'm here for more than just talking about the course curriculum. A lot of students just come in and talk. I had one student who popped into my virtual connection hours and said, I'm really struggling, not so much with your class, but with the fact that, I can't find a quiet place to work and to study. There's 11 of my family members in my home. We are a large kind of communal family, and it's really hard to find time and space to get my work done and be able to focus on my education. And so I think those are some of the things that might be coming up for a lot of faculty that maybe we wouldn't have heard in a traditional face-to-face. And that's really about that human connection. We also need to make sure that we're creating accessible content for our courses and our students. There's a lot of conversations right now about synchronous versus asynchronous courses, and we'll talk about that here throughout this webinar. But I think it's at its core, your students. I always recommend going through this sort of change that you survey your students. Find out, what is their access to computers and devices and Wi-Fi when a campus is closed down. I saw my first, what I'm calling COVID withdrawal form just yesterday, not because a student was sick, but because they had to pick up extra hours at their work. They're working at a grocery store. And because family members had lost hours at their respective works, they had the opportunity to pick up more work. And so if I had been doing a synchronous class, he wouldn't have been able to join because they were now working hours. Do your students have siblings or young children that they have to care for? as a result of their schools being closed. And so I think those are things that we need to consider when converting our classes. So what are some of the key strategies that we can do for moving our course online? First one is thinking about your class navigation to really keep things simple. Are your assignments and information easy to locate? Are your materials accessible? Is it clear on how students will turn in their work? Have you provided instructions? Even if you've been using your learning management system and your students have been using it, don't assume that they know what to do. And so make sure that you post all your information very clearly, that you post deadlines really prominently. And I think that goes into my second point here, which is repeat. To repeat this really important information in multiple ways and places. You know, maybe your LMS has the ability to remind them of due dates. I do a weekly email out to my students that kind of covers everything that they need to know to be focused on the week. It's really just a cut and paste from my syllabi, but it's another way of putting that information in front of their face so that they know kind of what's going on. And it also gives me an opportunity in those emails to students to be able to provide some common feedback. You know, if when I'm doing grading and I notice that everybody is having a particular challenge, or I want to remind them about, you know, a deadline or something coming up, I can do that in these weekly emails as well. And so I thought I would just show a little example here about what one of my classes looks like here. So I have, you know, telling students, you know, watch this lecture, here's this quiz, here's an assignment that's due on this date. And so I'm really trying to make it clear to them what is it that they need to do. And again, this is really a mirror of my syllabi. I've also made sure that I've included a revised syllabi, and I'm updating that as I make changes, because I made one big change when we realized that we were going from face-to-face to an online environment. But I also want to acknowledge that in the next 3 to 4 weeks, there may be other changes to make. And so I'm making sure that I'm still keeping that original syllabi that might have all my policies, but then including revisions here for them. I've got a link to my Zoom office hours so that they know how to reach me. And then all those emails that I send students are actually, I keep a copy of them in announcements. And so you can see an example here of an announcement that I've sent out, which kind of provides an introduction to our week, gives them, you know, kind of a highlight of the things that they need to be doing. So it's really kind of repeating what's on the syllabi, what's on the main page of my LMS. Thinking about design, adapting those best practices in your courses design when it's possible, right? Acknowledging, again, we're kind of doing what we can. But what are some of the things that you can do? If you're doing a asynchronous lecture, for example, if you've decided to record lectures and post them, students don't have that same level of attention span sitting in front of a computer that they might have in your class. Or maybe they didn't have that attention span in your class to begin with, right? But you could see that. You could notice that when you were losing your audience, you could pull them back in. You can't really do that in a pre-recorded lecture online. And so best practice would say anywhere between breaking up your course content between 10 and 20 minutes. You really shouldn't have a recorded lecture that's more than 20 minutes. Again, going to kind of the overall best practices. Maybe you have students that can sit longer and you know that about them, but generally speaking, that's one of the kind of key best practices, right? If you had a 50 or 75-minute lecture before, you probably didn't lecture all the time. You might call on students, you might do some pair sharing, you might break them up into small groups. If you're not doing that in an online class, your kind of delivery of your course material is going to be a little shorter. When it comes to quizzes and exams, you can do a whole bunch of different things. And chances are, if you're using a traditional textbook, it came with a test bank that you might be able to draw from. So if you're doing a quiz that is being proctored through your learning management software, you can do things like sorting questions. So that way, Not everybody's question number 1 looks exactly the same. You can randomly sort the answers within your multiple choice question. So again, what is answer A for this question is not always answer A for everybody. I will say a caveat there is you have to make sure that if you're doing the answer sort, that you don't have questions that say things like both A and B, because then that might screw things up. You also have to think about all of the above, because if all of the above now becomes answer B, that might be a little bit confusing. So you do have to think about the types of questions that you have there. How much time are you going to give your students? Again, that kind of goes down to what types of questions. If you have, say, a multiple choice that is very logic driven, that requires a lot of thinking, maybe you're giving them, 1.5 to 2 minutes per question to answer. But if they're pretty straightforward, kind of, simple level memorization, maybe you give them 1 minute per question. And so those are things that you have to assess based on how much time. When I do a quiz that has both multiple choice and an essay, I actually divide that into 2 quizzes. So that way they take one part and then they take the other part. And I give them specific time limits for both of those. So if I think that they should spend, no more than an average of 1 minute per question, and I've given them 30 questions, so they have 30 minutes to do that part of the exam. And then I say, okay, here's your essay, you get 30 minutes or whatever to do that part. Then I, kind of chunk that up separately. One of the other things that you can do with questions is you can present them often 1 question per page, and you can also prevent backtracking. So what that means is that a student sees a question, they have to answer that question in that moment. If they skip it, then they can't come back to it. And best practices would say that that helps reduce cheating. That helps kind of look up, if you have a closed book, closed note exam, it prevents them from going, okay, these are all the ones I know, and then I'm going to go back and look up the ones I don't. But one of the questions you might want to ask yourself is, do you need to have a closed book, closed note exam for a particular quiz? And those are some of the decisions that you want to make. And then also kind of consider reducing your curriculum to some of the key points. We may not be able to cover everything in detail that we wanted to. We also know that students only remember a portion of what we teach them in our classes. So given some of these new learning environments, maybe some of the challenges that they're facing outside, they might be less focused. They might have more going on. So what are some of the key takeaways that you really want them to know from your class? The class that you're teaching, how does it fit into your curriculum? Is it a core requirement or is it an elective? Is it a prerequisite where they're going to need to know this information, pretty significantly before they move on to a next course? And so you can assess those different things in terms of how you want to divide up your curriculum. And then finally, how are you going to communicate? You used to see them 2, maybe 3 times a week plus office hours. Now, how you're going to connect with them, this kind of also goes back to repeating information in sense that, are you emailing with them? Are you holding virtual office hours and the like? When we think about some of these methods of online course delivery, so we have synchronous and we have asynchronous. You are participating right now in a synchronous learning experience, right? You all logged on to Zoom, maybe with a few technical issues on either part. You set aside a time in your day and you're all together just as you would have been in the classroom. I think that there are some classes that works really well for, but one of the things that seems to be ringing very true in the literature right now is that really best for your students under this time period, right? Given some of the other challenges that you go through and that your students are going through. And so that's where I think going back to communicating with your students, understanding where they're at, what works for them. I would say that if you are going to do synchronous learning, make sure that you're recording your session so that way it's available for those that maybe couldn't join in online. So that would be a point of recommendation there. But then there's also asynchronous learning, and that is basically allowing students to come in at various different times when it's convenient to them to watch maybe pre-recorded lectures, complete activities, and the like. I tend to do asynchronous learning, and I chunk up my courses so that they can log on anytime between Monday at 12:01 a.m. to Sunday at 11:59 p.m. and they can complete their learning. And so that gives them the whole week for them to kind of balance out when they can get things done. But I think that there's a lot of different options within asynchronous learning that maybe we might not be familiar with. And I really liked this graph. This comes from Daniel Stafford, who's the Director of Faculty Development and Technology Innovation at DePaul University. And he really kind of said, well, think about your class not as synchronous or asynchronous, but in terms of what's your bandwidth and what's your immediacy, right? And if you can answer those two questions, that helps you decide which of these four quadrants you want to be in. So if you want high bandwidth and high immediacy, that's doing what we're doing here today, a video conference or maybe an audio conference, right? That's one option. But if you go to the flip side of that, very low bandwidth, low immediacy, again, giving students those opportunities to turn in things maybe throughout a specific time period. I think this is an area that is often, he argues that this is an area too, that is underappreciated because you can get a lot of work done here in that green area, right? You might have readings with text and images, okay? We give that to them now in a textbook, right? That's, their foundation. Email and discussion boards also kind of fall into this area, right? We've been using these sort of tools in online ed forever. And while it might make it sound maybe not as snazzy and not as techy, you can really create some fantastic experiences with just those sort of three tools. And again, this comes from Daniel Stafford. I think it's always really important that I acknowledge my sources here. The blue area, still low bandwidth, but allows students to work virtually kind of at the same time. These sort of collaborative documents, right? Maybe your students are very familiar already with Google Docs and they've been using that for group projects. Think of the ways that you might put that into play. Right? These kind of allow students to contribute, to edit, to comment, right? Depending on how you structure your assignment, that could be something that students could build on over an extended period of time. Maybe they're doing group chat or messaging. I know that a lot of students will share text messages and phone numbers as a faculty member. I don't usually recommend that they do that. I usually try and set up some of the different apps that can be used that allow students a little bit more privacy, like Slack or Remind. So it's something where they can subscribe to a group. Maybe if you have K-12 children, your teachers have used some of these tools to communicate with you as a parent. Think about ways in which you might employ those for your students. The yellow zone are these more kind of common asynchronous experiences, having pre-recorded video or pre-recorded audio, either as a lecture or as a discussion with your students. There's a lot of different technologies that you can use in there, and I'll mention a couple of them here and talk you through some of them that you can use, but that's a way that students can still feel like that they're seeing you or hearing you, but they don't have to be online at a specific time and have access to internet and things like that in that moment, but they still are able to kind of connect with you in that way. And then as I mentioned, those high bandwidth, high immediacy. I think, the question that we all need to ask each other is, while we might all say, yes, that's exactly what we would love to do because it's what's most like our traditional face-to-face class, you might want to ask yourself, are there things in these other quadrants that you might be able to accomplish your learning objectives without that traditional face-to-face, high immediacy, high bandwidth option. Because I think that goes into some of the challenges here. Students might be accessing your class on their phones, depending on what their access to technology device is. We know that a lot of our students, have these things, right? But maybe they don't have a computer, or they don't have an iPad, or they're sharing that with a sibling or another family member, let alone a device, their bandwidth, right? How many of you have been on a web chat and all of a sudden somebody kind of freezes in this really awkward pose, right? Maybe your bandwidth is being taxed at that moment because there's too many people on it. But then also too, I think we need to acknowledge that students might be caring for young children, their siblings, family members, right? If they had young children or siblings, I know I've got a 10-year-old, so I've all of a sudden become a 5th grade teacher as well as a college professor, right? So how do I balance those needs with the needs of my students? But I also think that brings up an interesting point about trigger warnings in our classes. Depending on your class, maybe you're off, you regularly use trigger warnings because of sensitive information. Right, well, given some of the topics we talk about, maybe that's not always suitable for young children to be part of those conversations, or if you're talking about serial killers, maybe you don't want to have your student hear that lecture in front of their 2-year-old sibling or something. I don't know. I know my viewing habits on television changed dramatically when I had a kid. And so I think about that kind of in this context as well, that, to assume that your students are participating in your class when there's other family members present. Okay, so what are some of our technology options? There are honestly hundreds. I tried to drill it down to ones that I've used, to ones that I've found are really helpful in this sort of situation. I use Camtasia, which is a screen recording device. I actually have it running simultaneously right now, so that way we can make this webinar available to those who couldn't join us today. And I'm happy in Q&A to do a little demo about how Camtasia works if people are interested. TechSmith does offer, if your university doesn't subscribe to Camtasia or have that available, TechSmith is doing a 30-day free trial available to everybody at this point in time. So that's an option for you there. I have some colleagues that use Screencast-O-Matic. That is a free tool, but it does limit you to 15-minute recordings, which honestly could be a great thing given best practices around how long you want your lectures to last. So when you think about chunking up your lectures, think about it in terms of key concepts. So for example, in my intro class, I have just a lecture on police organizations. And then I have a separate lecture on use of force. And then I have a separate lecture on critical incidences. And I have a separate lecture on police bureaucracy, right? And so each of those are about 10 to 15 minutes long, whereas maybe I would have broadly covered all of those topics over the course of a week in class. But this allows students to kind of come in and, kind of watch, but also rewatch lectures kind of in just short little snippets. If you don't want to do any sort of screencast over, right? So both of these will allow you to do video and audio, kind of overlaying with a PowerPoint or whatever screencast that you're showing on your computer. If you just want to do an audio lecture that then maybe students would listen to while maybe looking at your PowerPoint slides, Audacity is a free tool. You can use it to make podcasts. So it's also an option that if you wanted your students to make a podcast, they could use that as a tool there. But it would allow you to create a audio file that then they could download, listen to while maybe they are taking notes and looking at a PowerPoint printout of your slides. Some of the ways that you can engage and communicate with students, we already talked about Google Docs And I mentioned Remind, which is an app that I learned about from a K-12 teacher, but it allows, rather than people sharing their cell phone numbers and information, it allows for everybody to subscribe to a Remind group, and then you can deliver messages through that, and it'll pop through their cell phone, just like a text message would, but still kind of maintaining some of that privacy. Padlet, I actually have an example of Padlet here on the screen. I use this in lieu of kind of quick discussion boards. To me, this is a way that you can show, get your students engaging about a particular lecture or idea or concept. It does not integrate with your learning management system the way that a discussion board would. So you would have to find a different way to grade it. Notice I blocked out the black, with black here, all the names of my students, but normally I could go through and go, this was like a participate, non-participate, check, check, check. It's a great way to actually assess student participation differently than a discussion board, right? Maybe in a discussion board, you have a grading rubric that you're requiring students to mention very specific things, right? They have to respond to so many classmates, right? That's a very different learning tool than, to me, Padlet is like, hey guys, what did you think about this? And your students are basically raising their hand, but they're doing it in a virtual environment here. And it allows kind of everybody to see in a nice screenshot what all their classmates are thinking, right? Maybe you've given them a video to watch and you want them to post one thing that they took away from that video. This is a great option. And then you also, to me, I feel like, then I know that my students are actually looking at what others had to say about that video or assignment or whatever we did, versus a discussion board, unless you're requiring students to go back in and reply and contribute, right? How do you know that they really said things? And I also found too that some of my replies that I would get were not real rich, right? In terms of text. I would get things like, wow, Christy, that was really awesome. I love how when you added 2 + 2, it equaled 4. Good job, right? To me, that didn't feel like value added in a conversation, but using Padlet allows me to kind of hear from everybody what they're thinking about something. I've also used a Wix, which is a way that students can build websites. I've done, build a website as an assignment. Again, it's another way to kind of crowdsource maybe a research project and to share with the world what they're doing rather than just presenting it in a classroom. And then finally, YouTube. I use YouTube to upload all of my lectures that I'm doing that I pre-record. I do that for a couple of reasons. One, it helps condense the size of the file down to a way that is easier for students to look at. And again, even if they don't have a computer, they can listen to or watch a YouTube on an app on their phone, assuming that they have a smartphone, which, it seems, at least for my students, most of them do seem to have that technology. So they can do that. But also what I like about YouTube is that it will provide transcription to your videos. It's not always perfect, right? And it probably wouldn't meet the most rigorous of standards in terms of accessibility. But I feel like in this time, it's something, and it does provide an option that doesn't require you to go in and or somebody on your campus to go in and hand transcribe all of your lectures. So again, it's kind of a way to meet that challenge. Work-life balance. I feel like this is something that we talk and joke about a lot at conferences and within academia in general, but I think that there are some really key points here that we need to acknowledge. One is thinking about chunking your time, right? If you are particularly, again, in charge of others in your household, one of the pieces of advice here that I frequently hear is to have a designated email time. So that way you know that you're always replying to emails. I will be the first to acknowledge that I am horrible at this. It is just not my forte. I am not good about setting aside a designated email time. I tend to, check my email several times throughout the day, but just because I can't do it doesn't mean that you can't either, right? So I put it out here. One of the things that I do find useful though is a Pomodoro technique, and that's this idea that you set a timer. The one that I've used most often is a 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, and I've done that with my writing where I give myself in 30-minute blocks, 25 minutes, I'm focused on writing, I've shut down all my apps, I've put my phone away, I'm not looking at email, I write for 25 minutes, and then I have 5 minutes where I go, okay, I'm gonna go get up, I'm gonna go get a snack, I'll check Facebook, whatever, it gives me that break. But it helps me kind of organize my day so that way I feel a little bit more productive. Setting boundaries for your work hours, again, maybe that's a huge piece of comedy, right? But I think more than ever in this time, right, your family members and friends and you will have different needs that maybe you handled differently in the past. And so do you set boundaries for your work hours? I know I'm a late worker usually, so I do tend to work more in the afternoon and maybe then evening after my kids have gone to bed, but I've always been that way. But then now that allows me to have the mornings to help my son with schoolwork. I curse Common Core, math, it's just not my friend, but that kind of allows me to make sure that I'm meeting everybody's needs. Finding new ways for connection under these sort of shelter-in-place social distancing guidelines, I think is really important. I have a Zoom date with my colleagues in my hallway on Friday, right? We're used to just everybody kind of being around and being social. And so we said, hey, let's have a virtual lunch. We're all gonna bring our lunch, and be on Zoom and be able just to kind of gab with people. I did a virtual happy hour with some friends the other night. We all had our glass of wine and we, were able to talk and connect, right? It's finding ways to still find connection when you're not allowed to be around people, right? Support, and I think part of that also goes into supporting your mental health needs during this time. This is, again, new and different and scary. We've never seen anything like this. Our parents have never seen anything like this, really, depending on your age. But making sure that you're supportive of your mental health needs, physical needs, right, in the sense of getting outside, getting some fresh air, doing something for yourself every day, I think is really important and crucial there. And so I saw this as a meme on Facebook, and I thought it was really appropriate. And so I included it here as something to kind of share with everybody. That when we're in quarantine, what are some of the questions that we can ask ourselves, right? Just to kind of stay positive and balanced through all of this chaos, right? What are we grateful for today? Who am I checking in on or connecting with today? Really, how are we letting go of some of these expectations of normal, right? None of this is normal, not our classes, not our lives. How am I getting outside today in a safe way, right? Maintaining social distance, right? How am I moving my body, right? Making sure, yes, the gym is closed, but can you get movement in? Can you just feel healthy, right? And I like this one. What sort of beauty am I either creating, cultivating, or inviting in today? I think that a lot of these things are things that we probably didn't do for ourselves before this whole event, but maybe this gives us an opportunity to do so. So with that, I wanted to kind of open things up for a Q&A. I did include a link here to a survey from Sage, just to kind of, that way we know who's here. We know kind of some other feedback about this and other workshops. And also too, if you include your information there, I can send you this presentation as a PowerPoint slides as well. So that way you can have a reference to those links that I've shared throughout this presentation. So, but I'm gonna go ahead and minimize this screen. And so that way I can see everybody on Zoom here. Anybody that has a question?
And Stacy, we've actually already had a few questions come in while you were presenting that I wanted to make sure I was documenting and that we were getting to. So the first question is from Rebecca, and she asked if you have any information on how to get started with using YouTube for creating a YouTube channel or anything like that for your students.
Sure. Actually what you need is, I think it's, you just basically set up an account with, I think it's a Google account, because YouTube is, like many other things, owned by Google. And you can set up an account that would allow you to upload videos. Because I use Camtasia, I actually link my YouTube account to my Camtasia, and then it's a plugin, and it basically, when I go to share, so I can kind of bring up Camtasia here on my shared screen, and basically when I go to share up here, it actually gives me the option to upload directly to YouTube, and then I'm already recorded in there. But I think that there is a way there to making sure that you can. It's very easy. You literally just register with your email. They are free to do. One thing I would share is that when you are creating YouTube videos, one of the things that I do with all of my lectures is I make them unlisted, right? So that way a student actually has to have a link to find my lecture. They can't just, Google me on YouTube and find all my stuff. They actually have to have a link that will direct them there. And so there's a setting that's called public, which lets everybody see them. There's a setting called private, which means nobody can see it, or unlisted, that if you had the web link, then only those people can see those. So
great, thanks, Stacy. Another question came in from Cassandra. She asked, "What do you use Wix for?" And another participant had said that they use Wix to allow students to share their projects with other students, or so other students can see the hard work of other people, but that sharing is optional.
Right. So I use Wix actually when I've had students do collaborative group projects. It basically gives them a template without having to know anything about coding or anything. It allows them to create a web page, right? And so then they can share that web page and they can all collaborate together on that as a group assignment. So maybe instead of doing a presentation, instead of writing a formal research paper, they can create a website around that topic.
Great. And then another question that we got was from Sherry, and several other people have said this as well, that they get students who complain if they don't email them back right away, even with setting boundaries. So I think the question is, like, what strategies are there out there for us to really mitigate student expectations around response time so that you can have those healthy boundaries for yourself?
Well, I think that's where it comes into, for those people that are able to set aside a time, maybe it's from 8 to 9 in the morning and from 3 to 4 in the afternoon, right? If you were working a traditional 8 to 5, which, let's face it, as academics, almost none of us do that. But if you were, right, then you have 2 dedicated times. Communicate that to students so that they know when that you would be responding, right? I think if you let them know, hey, I will return all emails Monday through Friday within 48 hours, right? You can communicate that boundary to them. I will return emails every day between 10 and 11 o'clock, Monday through Friday, right? I think whatever boundary you set, communicate that with your students, because otherwise they will probably have the expectation that you will always be available to them at any time, maybe even more so now.
Great. Then Sherry had also asked, do you find Padlet better than the blog feature in the Blackboard, so the built-in Blackboard feature?
So I don't have Blackboard as an LMS system, so I don't know what their feature looks like. So I can't really say if one is better or worse than another, but I think that Padlet does a similar feature to a blog. And so again, because we have Moodle, I haven't used Blackboard in probably 10 years, and so I'm not real familiar with their blog feature, but I think that they work similarly.
Great. And then another question that came in is, what type of hands-on exercises could you assign students via Canvas or another LMS?
I think it depends on the class that you're teaching, right? So for example, teaching intro, I give them an activity where they, and I break it up into several different components where it's like, okay, go research the crime stats for an index crime, right? How is this changed from 1 year, 5 year, 10 years? So they have to go out and do that. And then I have them come back and do the same with like the National Crime Victimization Survey, right? I have them do it through a couple of different ways. And then, for example, I'll say, okay, now take this information and prepare a fair and accurate newspaper article. So that way they can think about, like, how is this sort of information disseminated to the public? And then maybe the fun one is take this kernel of truth and create fake news out of it. My students seem to really enjoy that one, right? How extreme can they go? How inflammatory can they go, right? Regardless of the political spectrum, because you can go to one side or the other on that. And to say, like, here's how you can take a data point and create something that is incredibly accurate and, truth, and also maybe something that is inaccurate. So, but I think in terms of those sort of kind of hands-on activities, it can vary dramatically with your class. So I think the question to ask yourself is, what did you do before in terms of, maybe was it pair sharing? Was it about having them work on a group project? And how can you maybe use technology to integrate those experiences, right? Is it a Google Share Doc? Is it a Padlet or a blog or a website, right? What are some of the ways in which you can use technology in ways that aren't scary and overwhelming? Because, I think it's probably scarier and more overwhelming to the faculty than it is the student. But thinking of ways in which you can still create that sort of connection and meaningful experience.
Another question that came in over the chat is, could these tools be integrated with Blackboard?
Well, I think I mentioned that Padlet does not directly link, right, to the LMS systems, right? And so it does require you to link them. But I mean, in the sense of from a self-grading or an being able to grade them within the system, right? You would have to have two windows open in that respects. But all of the tools that you're using, so Padlet, for example, right, it would create a link, right? And so you would then create a link on your LMS that students would then go to, much as if you were asking them to go and watch, say, a TED Talk. There is a ton of really amazing TED Talks that you can integrate into your classes. If you like cheeky humor, right, there's always John Oliver, right? Watching out for the language, of course. He tends to, blow a few four-letter words. But I think there are ways in which you can include links to outside resources within your, Blackboard or Canvas or Moodle course site, and still be able to, show that students are clicking on them. Like, I know that in ours, we have the ability to show that was a link clicked on, right? Did they complete the video, right? If you didn't have a Q&A response or anything after that. But I can see who watched it, when they watched it, that sort of realm. So that allows me to at least give participation points in that way.
Great. And then Kate also had just a really excellent suggestion in the chat for those who haven't seen it regarding just students expecting responses, which was just to gently remind your students that this is a transition for instructors as well, and for you too, and to just kind of remind them that you're a human as well, and gently add that in.
Yeah, I think, you know, the more connection and the more humanity that we can show our students and vice versa in this situation is really important. So.
Well, do we have any other questions?
Jessica, I'll say I like when you talk, because then your video shows up on everyone's screen with a very nice background now.
Thank you. I took your suggestion. We are sage and we are listening. So again, thank you so much, everyone. This session was recorded, so we will get that out. I will resend the link to the survey. I know Rita said she had an issue with getting stuck on that. I think I just went in and made sure that no superfluous questions were required. So hopefully that will resolve that. But if anybody has any issues with the survey, feel free to reach out to me directly over email. I'm including my email in the chat box right now as well. And so we want to make sure that you get the resources associated with that. And then as well, I'm going to send another link to just about some of the resources that Sage has as well to help with this. You know, we are participating in a program with Vital Source and Red Shelf, where students can have access to e-versions of the books that have been assigned. You know, so for some students, they had to leave, they didn't get their textbooks, or now that they're online, they might prefer a digital version. So we want to make sure that students have that as well, and also list some of the different resources that Sage offers. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we look forward to seeing you at future sessions of our faculty development workshop. And thank you again, Stacy.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I mean, I hope that people got, you know, some valuable resources out of this, maybe some new ideas. The other thing I would leave with is, you know, an acknowledgement that your class might change several times over the next few weeks, right? So that even if you make some changes now, you might continually assess and reassess about what's working for you, what's working for your students. And really consider the community that you create with you and your students, and that'll help everybody kind of get through all this.
Great. Well, thank you again, Stacy. I really appreciate you making time for this.
Absolutely. Thanks all.